So often, when we listen to true crime stories, we hear about the person whose smile lit up a room, someone with big dreams which are taken away in a senseless act of violence. But this isn't that kind of story. This is a case where the lines between victim and perpetrator blur, and where tragedy lies not just in the act of murder itself, but in the years of abuse and neglect that led up to it. Settle in, because the murder of Eve Howells has many twists and turns, and it might just leave you questioning whether she is truly the victim at all. This case takes place against the backdrop of Huddersfield, which is located to the northeast of Manchester in London. Huddersfield is a quintessential English town founded in the early Anglo-Saxon times. In those days, it was a market village, and it played a significant role in the local economy. During the Industrial Revolution of the early 1800s, Huddersfield was known as a hub for textile production. There are many rivers surrounding the town, which provided factories with the large volumes of water they needed to process textiles. That was until mechanized weaving was invented, and mills became a relic of the past. But in modern times, the area is still known for its wool fabric production. It was in this typical English town that Evelyn Dalton was born in 1947. She was always known as Eve to her friends and family. She was raised in a middle-class home and attended a local public school. Eve was a cheerful and friendly girl who loved to read, but she loved children above everything else. Eve couldn't wait to be a mother. When she finished high school, she trained to be a teacher so she could be around kids all the time. In the late 1960s, Eve joined the British Legion. This is a charitable organisation in the United Kingdom which provides support to members and veterans of the British Armed Forces. At a Legion event in 1971, Eve met David Howells. Eve fell in love with David quickly. He was a kind guy who seemed to want the same things as her: to get married, buy a house, have a couple of kids, and live out their golden years surrounded by grandchildren. They dated for just over a year, which gave David enough time to save up for an engagement ring. 2 years after that first meeting, they got married in a small ceremony at the local church in Huddersfield. Not long after the wedding, they signed the paperwork to purchase a quaint bungalow in Dalton Green Lane. This was a middle-class part of town and the perfect place to start their family. The home came complete with ivy weaving around the windows and a large backyard which would be perfect for their future children. David and Eve got right to it, and it wasn't long before they were celebrating their first pregnancy. When Eve found out she was pregnant, she couldn't wait to tell everyone she knew. She proudly showed off her rounding belly and graciously accepted gifts for her unborn child. As she neared the end of her pregnancy, she stopped work and spent her time at home preparing for their lives to change. A few months later, David and Eve welcomed their first child, a healthy baby boy they named Gareth. Eve was over the moon at becoming a mum, and she never complained about the sleepless nights and bone-deep exhaustion she felt. She seemed to cherish every moment. You could see her staring deeply into Gareth's eyes, filled with maternal love. But tragedy was just around the corner for the young family. Gareth died when he was still an infant, and the circumstances of his death are not clear. It will come as no surprise that David and Eve experienced a deep period of mourning over the death of their beloved boy. David still had to go to work, but Eve had nothing to go back to, just an empty home filled with reminders of the beautiful boy they had lost. In those days, there was very little help for parents who had lost a child. The attitude was very much to leave the past behind them, get over it, and try again for another baby who would take away the pain of their heartbreaking loss. Friends and family noticed that Eve was taking the death particularly hard, and they whispered about her changing personality, and that she seemed to have been sad for far longer than they thought was reasonable. They told themselves she would go back to normal just as soon as she had another baby in her arms. It wasn't long before David and Eve found out they were pregnant for the second time. But this time, Eve didn't seem to connect with her growing belly. She hid it away under baggy clothes, and she never talked about the baby or her dreams for her child. Unlike during her pregnancy with Gareth, she didn't set up the cot or any of the toys until it was just a few days before she was expected to give birth. Everyone put her strange behaviour down to a fear of losing another child, and they were sure she would get better once her baby was born. But when Glenn arrived, Eve only got worse. She struggled to connect with her baby. She didn't want to hold Glenn or change him or talk to him. It's easy to look back now and see that Eve was likely suffering from severe postnatal depression or PTSD from the loss of her first child. But in those days, mental health issues like this weren't talked about, and Eve may not even have had the language to describe how she was feeling. Glenn was a fairly easygoing baby, but Eve always spoke negatively about him. The way she handled him was cold and unloving, almost as if she resented his very presence in her home. There was no cooing or smiling or cuddling. All of this was bad enough for family members to witness. But David noticed something even worse. When no one else was around, Eve would make strange comments about how Glenn was responsible for Gareth's death. This continued for another 1.5 years until Eve fell pregnant again. 9 months later, David and Eve welcomed another son they named John. Eve's treatment of the children seemed to improve, but only a little bit, and not for very long. She still spoke negatively about them and blamed everything that went wrong in her life on them. As the boys got older, the constant negativity took a toll on the whole family. All the boys wanted was Eve's love and affection, but she was either unable or unwilling to give it to them. For David's part, he was away most of the time at work, and when he was around in the evenings, he played the peacemaker, or he simply ignored Eve's negative behaviour, maybe in the hope that she would just stop doing it. But we all know that ignoring a problem never resolves the problem, and in this case, the treatment of the boys only got worse. By the time John and Glenn started school, they were showing clear signs of detachment and emotional distress. School could have been a way for the boys to escape the hostility they experienced at home, but because they had never experienced friendship or love or really even joy, they were unable to build relationships with their peers. They were looked at as the weird kids and isolated in just the same way they were at home. This treatment continued throughout the boys' school years. By the time they were teenagers, the feelings of isolation and rejection had deepened into bitter resentment. Yet beneath that bitterness, there remained a desperate yearning for the love and affection they had never received. They were desperate to please and clinging to any chance of approval. But the few attempts they made to connect with others were awkward and strained. As their emotional isolation grew, so too did their anger and frustration. The boys became withdrawn, and they were trapped in a vicious cycle of rejection and bitterness, but still trying to get the love and acceptance that seemed out of their reach. Then, in 1995, Glenn and John were offered a lifeline. Finally, a way out from under the one person who had made their lives so unbearable. It was late in the evening of the 31st of August 1995 when the police in Huddersfield received a frantic phone call. A young man was reporting a break-in at a home on Dalton Green Lane. He told them someone had been hurt and they needed to hurry. A few minutes later, officers arrived at the Howells home. Just as the caller had said, there were clear signs of a break-in. The front window was smashed and personal belongings were strewn all over the floor inside the home. But it wasn't the mess that captured the officers' attention. Their eyes were immediately drawn to the blood. It was everywhere, up the curtains, on the ceiling, pooling on the carpet. The source of that blood was the slumped-over body of a woman on the sofa in the middle of the living room. It was clear the woman had been violently attacked. The back of her skull was caved in, and blood oozed through her matted hair. By the time officers arrived, she was beyond help, and the woman was declared dead at the scene. Outside of the home, officers were consoling two teenage boys who introduced themselves as 14-year-old John and 15-year-old Glenn. The boys explained that they lived in the house and they were the ones who had called 999. They recounted that they had been out walking their dog and returned to find their home broken into. When they walked in the front door, they discovered their mother Eve had been attacked on the couch. She wasn't moving and there was a lot of blood, so they ran outside and used a neighbour's phone to call for help. Both of the boys were covered in blood. Through their tears, the boys were able to tell the officers that some money was missing from the house, but they couldn't be sure if anything else had been taken. The boys also told the police officers that their dad was at the local pub playing darts with his friends. In the age before cell phones, there was no way to call David, so an officer drove to the pub to collect him in person. When the police officer approached David at the table with his friends, he informed him that Eve had been murdered during a break-in. David was visibly shaken, and his first instinct was to ask if his boys were safe. The officer reassured him that John and Glenn were unharmed and that they were waiting for him back at their home. Before the police officer had even stopped his vehicle outside the house, David jumped out of the car and rushed to embrace his boys. After taking their initial statements, the boys and David were allowed to leave the scene after handing over their bloody t-shirts, which were put into evidence bags. Once the initial scene investigation at the home was complete, Eve's body was removed for an autopsy. The medical examiner determined that she had been beaten to death with a hammer. She had suffered at least 10 direct blows to the back of her head and neck, whilst in a seated position on the family couch. There was no sign of any defensive wounds, which indicated the attack had happened extremely quickly and unexpectedly. It was clear that Eve's death was a homicide, but the explanation of a robbery gone wrong didn't sit right with the lead detective. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. The scene at the house, combined with the stories provided by John, Glenn, and David, left him uneasy. His instincts told him there was more to the story than what met the eye, and he began to suspect that the truth might be far darker and more complex than anyone had initially believed. Part of what made him think there was more to the story was that from the outset, John, Glenn, and David displayed an unusual fixation on the money that had allegedly been stolen during the robbery. Every time officers questioned them about the events of that night, the family members all repeatedly brought up the money. Typically, the focus would be on the horrific loss of a loved one, especially when that person had been brutally murdered. And, according to the boys, they had run out of the house as soon as they realized their mum had been attacked, and yet they somehow had time to notice that a small amount of money was missing from the house. The persistent emphasis on the money raised suspicions that the boys might be trying too hard to frame the incident as a simple robbery gone wrong, to deflect attention away from what had really happened. And then there was the peculiar behaviour exhibited by the boys during the formal identification of their mother's body. Morgue staff had observed John and Glenn throughout the viewing, and at one point, Glenn glanced at John, smirked, and winked. In the context of looking at what was left of their mother on a cold slab in a morgue, it was extremely odd behaviour. All of this left the detectives wondering, were they really considering that a 14-year-old and 15-year-old boy might be involved in Eve's murder? And if so, why would they be driven to commit such a brutal act against their own mother? Aside from the winking incident, Glenn and John were observed to be quiet and gentle boys. They didn't raise their voices or make rude remarks. They just stood quietly unless they were being spoken to. Most of the time, they stood in the corner staring at the floor. This demeanour was out of line with them possibly being responsible for such a cold-blooded attack. It was these questions which made investigators consider that someone else might have been involved in the murder. And of course, the most likely other person to be involved was David. But David had a solid alibi. He had been at the pub most of the evening, which was corroborated by multiple witnesses and bar receipts, and he was promptly ruled out as being a suspect. During the course of the investigation, no other potential witnesses came to light, and the detectives turned to the forensic evidence to find the answers they were looking for. First up was the blood spatter. The patterns of the blood from the home were analysed to determine where Eve's killer would have been standing during the attack. The splatter on the walls, ceiling, and carpet was meticulously examined, and it all indicated that the killer must have been standing close to Eve, likely in a position of dominance over her as the blows to her head were struck. The height and angle of the splatter suggested a frenzied, almost desperate attack. There was one other place the blood was concentrated, and that was on the clothes which had been taken from the boys on the night of the murder. When the splatter patterns were compared, it became clear that both Glenn and John must have been in the vicinity of Eve's attack while it was happening. The blood was more concentrated on Glenn's clothing than it was on John's, but both indicated they were in the room when the attack took place. Finally, the investigators had concrete evidence to prove that the boys had not simply stumbled in on the crime after walking the dog. No one wanted to believe that two teenage boys could have so brutally killed their own mother and then behaved so casually afterwards. But the mounting evidence left little room for doubt. And so, Glenn and John were both arrested on suspicion of murder. The arrest meant they could be detained separately from each other and from their father. Detectives hoped this approach would lead to one or both of the boys revealing exactly what had happened that night. Because the boys were so young, they were unable to be interviewed without legal representation or a parent being in the room. But a judge did issue a warrant which allowed investigators to record conversations between David and his sons when he visited them in jail. Over the next few weeks, 12 of these conversations were secretly recorded. There was no smoking gun or direct confession about what had happened, but there were vague references to the night of the murder. David stated in one of these conversations, quote, "We've got to just bluff it out. If you two break, then I'm in as well, so we've got to stick together." End quote. Even though there was no straight-up confession, the conversations did cement the investigators' view that David was somehow involved in planning Eve's murder, even if he wasn't there on the night that it happened. David was brought in for questioning, but he denied any direct involvement in the crime. He did admit that he had a role, but that it only began after discovering what his sons had done to Eve. In a desperate attempt to protect John and Glenn, he had concocted a cover story about a robbery gone wrong. David told the investigators he was doing what any father would do in trying to protect his children. So David wasn't going to admit he had any part in the murder, and the investigators wondered if the boys would be the same. But to their surprise, when they finally sat down with Glenn and asked him to tell them what exactly had happened, he confessed to everything. He admitted that he had used the hammer to fatally attack his mother, and he insisted that he was fully responsible and that John was an innocent bystander who had tried to get him to stop. As to why he had decided to kill his mother, well, according to Glenn, Eve was not everything she seemed. She wasn't just dismissive or inattentive to her children. She was downright abusive. Glenn described a lifetime of trauma, abuse, and neglect. He spoke in detail about the years of torment that he and John had endured under their mother's iron-fisted rule. According to Glenn, from the moment they were born, life with Eve was nothing short of a nightmare. Eve had never bonded with either of her sons, and the nurturing love that most mothers show their children was completely absent from their lives. Instead, Eve ran the household like a dictator. She was a strict and unyielding disciplinarian, and she was obsessed with controlling every aspect of her husband and children's lives. For Glenn, the abuse started early, and it was relentless. Eve's resentment toward him was palpable, and it was fueled by her belief that Glenn was somehow to blame for the death of her firstborn child. She never let Glenn forget it. She called him names like fat fucker, fat little bastard, and constantly reminded him of her hatred. She would publicly shame him for the smallest mistakes and constantly belittle him, telling him that he was thick and that he would never find a job, never get married, and he would end up living on the streets. She told him he was unlovable and a street brat destined for a life of misery. John was only slightly better than Glenn in Eve's eyes, but he was not spared from her cruelty. As her favourite, he received some small privileges, but these did little to shield him from her harshness. Even though he avoided the worst of the humiliating punishments that Glenn got, he still faced the same neglect and control. Eve's favoritism was used as a twisted form of affection. John might get a sweet cup of tea as a reward, while Glenn was lucky to get a plain piece of bread. But it gets worse. Glenn was forced to massage his mother's naked body at every opportunity. She would hand him a bottle of lotion and make him rub it into her skin, all the while mocking him for trying to avoid looking at her so-called private parts. Eve would also enter the bathroom when Glenn was showering or bathing. She would take off her clothes until she was fully naked and then go to the toilet in front of him. She made Glenn spend hours cleaning the dirt from under her fingernails and toenails and called him her body slave. When it came to punishment, Eve's methods were cruel and calculated. For even the smallest mistakes, she would take a lighter to the boys' cherished stuffed toys and threaten to burn them alive, all with a smile on her face. If the boys did anything that displeased her, she would tell them they were going to be handed over to social services because she no longer wanted them as her children. Eve seemed to take a particular delight in telling them that she would ensure they were separated and that they would never see each other again. The physical abuse was just as relentless. Eve was often seen smacking the boys on their backs and legs for the slightest misstep. If they hesitated even for a moment when she called, she would drag them around by their hair. Her anger was explosive. She would yell at them, throw objects in their direction, and make sure they knew she could get rid of them at any minute. There was no tenderness in her actions. She never held them, hugged them, consoled them, or told them that she loved them. Even though John was Eve's favourite, he was equally traumatized by her neglect. At the age of just 5, He was taken to a psychologist after he was found burning £5 notes and urinating in rubbish bins. John was referred to a psychologist, but that didn't seem to bother Eve, and it didn't change how she treated him. Glenn described Eve as a woman who was consumed by her need for control. She kept the fridge and pantry locked to ensure no one could eat anything she didn't approve of. And even though she only weighed 38 kilograms or 83 pounds, she would force her family onto strict low-calorie diets. If the boys couldn't stomach what she forced them to eat, they would try to hide the food. Glenn remembered one particular incident where Eve discovered the food they had been hiding under the table for over a week. As a punishment, she forced them to eat what was left of the rotten remains. Eve's control extended beyond food. She also had complete dominance over the family's finances. 6 years before her death, she closed the joint account she shared with David and transferred £51,000 into her own account, which left David with just £100. Each week, David's wages and her wages were paid directly into her own account, and she would give her husband a tiny allowance each week if she felt he deserved it. And it wasn't just her own immediate family's money that she had control of. She also found a way to take over her father's finances. When he was given a substantial inheritance, Eve refused to release any of the funds to him, and instead she gave him an allowance, just like she had done with David. Eve's behaviour was particularly destructive on Glenn and John's young minds, because when she left the house, she wore the mask of a normal person. The boys were aware that she was capable of behaving differently, of showing kindness and maybe even warmth, but that side of her was reserved for anyone but them. Glenn told the investigators that this bleak upbringing was what drove him to commit murder. He described his actions not as the result of simple hatred, but as the culmination of years of suffering under her oppressive rule. The investigators could hardly believe the story Glenn was telling. Eve was a school teacher after all, and besides, if her treatment of the boys was as extreme as Glenn described, surely someone else would have noticed. Of course, they weren't naive about the fact that people can present themselves entirely different at home and at work, but was it possible to hide such a dreadful true nature? The short answer to that question is no, it's not possible. But the long answer requires people to actually take action when they notice troubling behaviour, especially when children are involved. And that's exactly what nobody did when it came to Eve, Glenn, and John. To find out more about Eve's personality, investigators interviewed her colleagues at Huddersfield Secondary School. As they did, more people started to come forward, and they all had very interesting views to share on who Eve was as a person. Through these interviews, a disturbing picture of Eve began to emerge. There was no sign of the young woman who had been so keen to start a family and be a great mum. Many of the teachers regarded Eve as unusual, and one colleague described her as very, very disturbed. The students echoed the same feelings. They said she ruled the classroom like a dictator, and just the sight of her struck fear into her students. These were almost the exact same words Glenn had used to describe how Eve was at home. Students found her so terrifying that they had given her the name Evil Howells, which was a twist on her name Eve. One of her colleagues, Maureen Smith, recalled, quote, "She created an atmosphere of fear like I've never experienced in 26 years of teaching. She was searing." End quote. Stories from Eve and David's neighbours were just as alarming. One neighbour remembered an incident where Eve had tied the boys to the kitchen table when they were just toddlers to punish them for some unspecified mistake. Another neighbour spoke of the dread that settled over them every evening when it was time for the boys to bathe. Quote, "We used to dread them going in for bath time because of the screams that used to come from the bathroom. The screams that came out were like someone was murdering them." End quote. Another neighbour admitted that he had stopped sitting in his garden because of the vile curses that Eve would hurl at her children, which he could hear from his home. Eve's own family was aware of her cruelty towards the children. Her stepmother, Mary, said, quote, "She seemed to have it in for Glenn for some reason. It was like she despised him. She never showed love. It seemed as though she despised her sons. She was very aggressive." End quote. Even their own grandfather wouldn't be around Eve when she was in one of her moods. It seems there were plenty of opportunities for professionals to identify that there were problems at home for the boys. When they started school, both of them were already displaying troubling behaviours that concerned their teachers. On top of John burning money and urinating in rubbish bins, he was also observed coming home from school, finding the pantry unlocked, and opening multiple tins of food, but he would only take a single spoonful from each and then hide the cans around the house and garden. He also chewed on his wooden bed frame and frequently broke his toys. A psychologist who evaluated John after Eve's murder described him as overly compliant and suggested that his odd behaviours were a form of rebellion against the rigid discipline he had endured his entire life. These troubling accounts came from so many different people, and yet they all painted the same chilling portrait of Eve as a woman who was known to be cruel, unkind, and vicious, who was known to mistreat and abuse her children, and yet she was never reported to the police or social services. No one stood up for Glenn and John, not even their own father. It was this fact which made investigators take another look at David. With all they now knew about Eve's true nature, it had become apparent that John and Glenn could not have carried out the horrific murder on their own. But before they confronted David, they wanted to hear John's perspective. When he was told that Glenn had confessed to being responsible for the murder, John broke down and confessed that not only was he involved, so was his father. According to John, David had been talking about killing Eve for months, but he knew it would be far too obvious if he committed the murder himself. Instead, he manipulated his children into doing his dirty work for them, just the same as Eve had been doing all their lives. While Glenn and John were coming clean about what really happened inside the Howells home, investigators stumbled upon information which clarified David's motive for wanting his wife dead, and it had nothing to do with her behaviour as a mother. The boys didn't know it then, but just 2 months before her death, David discovered that Eve had been having an affair. As he dug deeper into her behaviour, he realised that the affair had been going on for more than 12 years. To add insult to injury, the person Eve was sleeping with was Russell Hurst, the children's godfather and a close family friend. Russell was also one of David's colleagues, and he had joined the family on several vacations over the years. It later came out that during these trips, Eve would sneak out in the night to sleep with Russell. This was the final straw for David. He had stood by all those years while Eve doled out cruel and unusual punishments to their children. But sleeping with someone else, well, that was a bridge too far. He became obsessed with planning Eve's demise, especially because it would mean he would benefit from a £155,000 life insurance policy. Sex and money, the two greatest motivators. But David was smart enough to know he couldn't be directly involved in the murder. But he had access to 2 willing participants, and he began to groom his sons for the task. Whenever Eve wasn't around, he would discuss how much he hated her and how the only way out was to get rid of her once and for all. David and the boys considered various scenarios to get rid of Eve. Perhaps they could push her off a cliff, or stage a car accident, or arrange a family holiday where she accidentally fell from a high balcony. But in the end, they decided to go with something much closer to home. According to Glenn and John, the trio meticulously planned their crime. For months they discussed every detail, from staging the scene to how they should behave when the police arrived. And David made sure both of the boys knew to emphasize that money had gone missing from the house, to back up their story of a robbery gone wrong. Glenn gave them a detailed explanation of exactly what happened on the night of the 31st of August 1995. He revealed that they had deliberately chosen a night when there was a darts competition at the local pub, so David would have an extra strong alibi. The plan was for the boys to carry out the attack while David was away, and then call 999 to say there had been a break-in. That evening, David headed off to the pub, and just like Eve did every night, she ordered the boys to take the family dog for a walk. Glenn told the investigators that they took the dog outside and walked just far enough to be out of sight of the home. They sat there for 20 minutes, and when they came home, Eve immediately started in on them. Quote, "You two haven't walked the dog properly. You lazy, idle prick. Take it for a proper walk. When you get back, brush your effing teeth and go to your room and don't make a sound. You're spoiling my night and I don't like you." This outburst from Eve would be her last. Then Glenn explained what happened next. Quote, "I went in my room. I was angry. I changed my clothes. I thought, this has got to stop. I got the hammer. I went through to the lounge. I didn't think of anything. My mind just wasn't working right. John was in the bedroom. I just looked at my mum. Something in my head, and I just struck out. I heard my brother screaming and shouting. He was shouting, no, because I had hit my mum. I told him to get out. I told him to get hold of the dog. Just get out. I didn't want him to see it. I realized what I was doing. I said, sorry mum, I love you, I can't believe it. I heard her making some noise, but I didn't want her to come round and know I did it. So I hit her neck. I went through to my room and I couldn't believe what I had done. I didn't realize what I had done until I'd seen her. I wanted my mum back straight away." End quote. Glenn's story was difficult to hear, even for the most experienced officers, but still something wasn't adding up. Glenn spoke about that night like it was a spontaneous attack, but a few sentences prior, he said the trio had planned the murder specifically for that night to give David an alibi. All three had planned it to happen that night after walking the dog while David was at darts, and the boys had to stage the scene to look like a robbery. Even with both of David's sons implicating him directly in planning Eve's murder, he still refused to admit any responsibility. But ultimately, investigators believed John, Glenn, and David were equally culpable, and all three were charged with murder. In 1997, they pleaded not guilty, and their murder trial got underway. Ultimately, this case would come down to the jury deciding whether there was justification for Eve's murder. Glenn stuck to his story of a spontaneous attack after years of torment. The jury heard the secret recordings from the time they were in jail, and in them Glenn can be heard sobbing. Quote, "Got no dad anymore. Got no mum and dad want me mum." End quote. Glenn testified that he had made many attempts to escape from Eve's control. He called the youth mental health helpline several times and had tried to end his own life. Quote, "I couldn't do it. For the same reason I couldn't run away. I couldn't leave John on his own." End quote. He said a TV show had inspired him to use the hammer in the attack. And when he was asked, quote, "Would you have killed your mother without the approval of your father, depriving him of a wife?" Quote, Glenn had responded, quote, "She deprived me of my life." End quote. Glenn's testimony revealed a complex and conflicted relationship with his mother. On one side was deep-seated hatred, and on the other was a lingering, desperate love for his mother. This duality is not uncommon amongst survivors of abuse. Many will grapple with intense and contradictory emotions towards their abusers. For those who have never experienced such trauma, This blend of love and loathing can be confusing and difficult to comprehend. It's hard to imagine how someone can simultaneously detest and yearn for the affection of the person who has caused them so much pain. In court, the boys' lawyers highlighted that both Glenn and John had never been given a fair chance in life. From the very first day they were born, they were subjected to a life of deprivation, deprived of love, deprived of nurturing, and deprived of encouragement. What they endured at the hands of their mother was nothing short of repulsive. Even though Eve was the one who had inflicted the abuse, David was complicit simply through his inaction. He stood by as their mother and his wife humiliated, degraded, and tormented them. He had made a conscious choice to ignore their desperate pleas for leniency, connection, and protection. The prosecution also highlighted that David had exploited the boys' trauma for his own personal gain when he convinced his boys that murder was the only way out. And David's motive wasn't even to free them from the relentless abuse they had suffered. It was all to get revenge over an affair and to claim the life insurance money which he would miss out on if they simply got divorced. In the end, the boys were nothing more than pawns in David's cruel and self-serving plan. Even when the evidence proved he had orchestrated the whole thing, he abandoned his children once again, all in an effort to protect himself. When David got his turn on the stand, he called his son's stories wicked lies. He pointed the finger directly at them and absolved himself of any responsibility. Russell, who was Eve's lover, also testified in the murder trial. Strangely, he described her as a delightful lady. Quote, "Our relationship was special. It was not based on sex. Eve was the love of my life, a delightful lady." End quote. In an ironic twist, Russell was actually the main benefactor of Eve's life insurance policy. By the time the jury retired for deliberations, it wasn't clear which way they would go. Would they decide that the boys' trauma justified or at least contributed to their actions, and therefore they would get a lesser ruling than murder? Would David be found guilty for his role in orchestrating the killing? Or would they all be found responsible? Ultimately, it was the third option. David, Glenn, and John were all found guilty of the murder of Evelyn Howells. When it came time to sentencing, the judge described David as a, quote, thoroughly evil man who groomed or indoctrinated his sons to kill their mother while he was safely beyond suspicion as an actual participant. You were the instigator of this appalling crime, and you suborned your sons into doing what they did. Over a period of months, if not years, you so groomed and indoctrinated their young minds, and then they did what you wanted. They acted out to them what initially must have been unthinkable, while you were safely beyond suspicion. There can be nothing more vile than to get your sons to kill their mother, unless, as it is apparent from the tapes, you cheerfully contemplated their long detention while you walked free. Notwithstanding any deficiencies in the deceased as a wife and a mother, she did nothing to warrant the terrible death she suffered. He sentenced David to life imprisonment. Because Glenn and John were juveniles at the time of the murder, they were initially given sentences of indefinite detention. This meant it would be up to the justice system to determine when and if the boys could be released safely into the community. John's minimum sentence term was set to 7 years, and Glenn's was set to 10. In 2002, the brothers appealed their sentences to the Lord Chief Justice. Their lawyers argued, quote, Glenn feels that he should have been convicted of manslaughter and not murder, but states that he accepts full responsibility for his mother's death, and that she did not deserve what had happened. He states that he saw no other way of stopping the abuse he and his brother endured. He stated that John has played a lesser part of the crime and had been heavily influenced by his father and brother. End quote. The boys' appeal was successful, and John's sentence was reduced from 7 years to 6 years. Glenn had his sentence reduced from 10 years to 9 years. When David heard that his son's sentences had been reduced, he became jealous. So he filed his own appeal, but this was denied. David became eligible for parole in 2013. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case. In my view, child abuse is unforgivable. But does it justify murder? John and Glenn were just children, and their brains never had a chance to develop fully, which their father took advantage of when he manipulated them into murder. So are they fully responsible? Should they have been found guilty of murder? This story reminds us that the line between victim and perpetrator is not always as clear-cut as we might think.